From my beloved world, Sonia Sotomayor. Sonia Sotomayor is an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the first Latina to be appointed to the role. Raised in the Bronx borough of New York City, Sotomayor graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University and received a J.D. from Yale Law School, where she served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. She began her law career as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan before entering private practice. President George H.W. Bush nominated her to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York in 1991, and President Barack Obama nominated her to the Supreme Court in 2009. In this selection from her memoir, My Beloved World, 2013, Sotomayor describes the academic challenges she faced during her first year at Princeton. In the week since Alfred drove off with Mommy waving goodbye out the window, a look of doom overcoming her firm-set jaw, the collegiate fairy tale in my mind was becoming something more akin to science fiction. In part, it was the record-breaking heat that summer of 1972, which silvered Princeton's leafy vistas, endowing everything with a more unearthly aura than I had remembered. But I was also finding that many of my classmates seemed to come from another planet, and that impression was reciprocated. Waiting outside Dillon Gym, where we were to meet our advisors, I struck up a conversation with another freshman sitting beside me. She was from Alabama, she said. I had never before heard an accent like that in real life. I listened spellbound as she explained how her father, her grandfather, and her elder brother were all Princeton alums. She couldn't have been more delighted to be there representing her generation. And it really is just the friendliest, most welcoming place you'll find, she gushed. I mean, look at all the unusual people that come here. She was indicating an approaching pair, their heads together, laughing loudly. I recognized my roommate, Dolores, and our friend Teresa. Dolores was vaguely Mexican-looking, with light brown skin and Indian black hair. Teresa was barely a shade darker than I am, hardly dark at all, but her features were distinctively Latina. They both looked pretty normal to me. Without premeditation, I greeted them exuberantly in rapid-fire Spanish, though we usually spoke English together. I meant no malice toward the girl from Alabama, but my pulse was speeding with a sense of purpose. Nothing more needed to be said. Dolores Chavez was from New Mexico. We must have been assigned to room together because someone had assumed two Hispanics would have a lot in common. But all Dolores knew of Puerto Ricans came from West Side Story, and I suspect that initially she was half afraid I'd knife her in her sleep. I knew even less of New Mexico than she knew of New York. Dolores seemed to me a country girl, sweet-tempered, shy, and very far from home. One night soon after we'd arrived, she got her guitar out and sang softly for a while before we went to sleep, such deep longing in her voice. As social as I am, I was quiet in those early days, trying to make sense of the conversations flowing around me. One evening, I found myself with a group of girls sitting in our resident advisor's dorm room. One of them mentioned being invited to a wedding and that she decided just to choose a gift from the bridal registry. What the hell is a bridal registry? I wondered. Our advisor, a senior, allowed that her father sometimes received wedding invitations from people whose names he didn't even recognize, probably strangers hoping he would blame his memory and send a gift anyway, she figured. Who invites strangers to their wedding? For that matter, who sends them gifts? Where I came from, you handed the couple an envelope with money at the reception. Were people here so rich they could afford a wedding without gifts of cash? Whenever I felt out of place or homesick, I took refuge at Firestone Library. Books had seen me through an earlier time of trouble, and their presence all around me was both a comfort and an answer to the question of why I had come here. From my first day on campus, I'd enviously eyed the Carrolls in Firestone, which were reserved for upperclassmen. One day, one of those would be mine. Meanwhile, I reveled in the vastness of the main catalog room, riffling through the drawers full of cards, rows and rows of cabinets running almost the full length of the ground floor. And above them, like cathedral spires, rose the stacks, shelf after shelf, carrying a book for every card below, books ranging in subject from the majestic to the comically arcane. Here, in one of the world's great libraries, was my first exposure to the true breadth of human knowledge, the humbling immensity of what was known and thought, of which my days spent pawing the Encyclopedia Britannica had offered only a foretaste. My grazing in Firestone that first week was not at random, however. The course offerings at Princeton seemed a bewildering buffet, so many unfamiliar subjects that whetted my appetite. I dug into the library catalog to get a taste of each subject that tempted me before committing to a whole meal. At the same time, I was already well aware that in our freshman class, some, like me, were far fresher than others. Many from across the United States and abroad had gone to high schools that sounded more like mini colleges, with library buildings of their own and sophisticated electives. I had made it into Princeton, but in this way too, with far more meager resources than most. I was under no illusions about how much remedial education could be accomplished skimming a few books in the stacks. That there was no official pre-law curriculum turned out to be a blessing of sorts. I had to decide for myself what would be the most useful way to fill in the wide blank areas in my understanding. Having negligible prior knowledge of practically everything, I planned with each course to gulp down as much as I could. And so introductory surveys seemed ideal. I was drawn to psychology and sociology, having always been interested in the patterns of individual behavior, as well as the structure of communities. History, especially American, seemed essential and promised to reveal how a larger scheme of things had developed over time. Moral philosophy sounded a lot like what I imagined legal reasoning to involve. And just from reading the newspaper since entering Spelman, I knew that one day I would need to grapple with economics. An art history survey seemed like just the way to answer the many questions that had lapped at my mind since my childhood visit to the Ponce Museum. But I would err on the side of practicality for now, saving that one for a sophomore treat. My advisor approved my course load without question, and I felt I was on my way. But back at the dorm, deflation awaited. Everyone had returned from taking care of the same business, and the freshman floor was abuzz with talk of exotic upper-level courses my classmates were taking thanks to their advanced placement work in high school, which had allowed them to leapfrog ahead. By comparison, my course selection sounded boring, even lazy. Was I squandering an opportunity to really challenge myself? Maybe I just wasn't as smart as they were? That tide of insecurity would come in and out over the years, sometimes stranding me for a while but occasionally lifting me just beyond what I thought I could accomplish. Either way, it would wash over the same bedrock certainty. Ultimately, I know myself. At each stage of my life, I've had a pretty clear notion of my needs and of what I was ready for. There would be time enough in those 4 years at Princeton to sample Chinese politics and Roman law, to delve into social disorganization, crime, and deviant behavior. Meanwhile, the introductory surveys would involve just as much work, given their broad scope, as more specialized advanced courses, and would allow me for the first time to cultivate the critical faculties that Miss Katz had tried to instill, understanding the world by engaging with its big questions rather than just absorbing the factual particulars. This was the way to be a student of anything, and learning it has served me ever since. As a lawyer, and even more as a judge, I would often be called upon to make myself a temporary expert in some field for the duration of a case. From the sciences to technology to the arts, the variety of industries and other endeavors that come before the courts is vast, and often there is no determining how the law applies without a working knowledge of the field in question. I still had to choose a science lab course to meet a core requirement. Those in the natural sciences were known to be backbreakers, requiring a share of one's waking hours more appropriate for a pre-med or a budding scientist than an aspiring lawyer. I did notice, however, that introductory psychology included a lab that met the need. An introduction to Freud and other schools of thought, as well as an overview of brain function, seemed as if it might prove very handy over time. There was only one challenge to overcome, but one far more daunting than any rigors of organic chemistry or molecular biology labs: rats. I have always had a deathly fear of anything that scurries or crawls, bugs, rodents, what have you. It isn't just the stereotypical fear of a lady standing on a chair, though I've done that. The special revulsion, I feel, goes back to childhood. The giant cockroaches that infested the projects one year, we called them water bugs, brought me to hysteria. How many times had I seen my mother take the whole place apart trying to locate the nest? The very thought of their proximity would keep me awake all night. And so when I realized that the psych lab would oblige me to handle rodents while I studied their reactions, I decided, a little perversely, to make the most of it. Undertaking a course of what psychologists call exposure therapy, I devised an experiment that required me not only to hold the rats, but to implant electrodes in their brains. It was going surprisingly well at first. I had steeled myself to picking the rats up by the tail and holding their furry bodies as I gave them a sedative injection. Once they were drugged, implanting the electrodes wasn't so bad. Tracking their behavior was no fun. It meant watching them continuously, without turning away in disgust. But I was doing it. It wasn't until the final weeks of the semester that everything went awry. I came into the lab one day to find all my rats milling around the same spot in the cage in an oddly intent way. I couldn't see what the attraction was, but the sight of their frenzied huddle was enough to stir the old revulsion. I certainly wasn't going to stick a hand in that cage. I found a stick and poked one of them off the pile. He turned to look at me, and in the gap that opened up, I saw the rat they were gnawing at, its abdomen already half devoured. The grad student overseeing my efforts intercepted me as I ran out of the room screaming. Trying to contain my hysterics, he explained that cannibalism is normal rat behavior, that it had evolved as a way to control disease in the population and, as such, was a widely recognized sign of plague. Somehow that didn't help. He suggested I calm down and come back tomorrow. The next day my state of mind was no better. The trauma had done its damage. It was horrifying even to imagine handling a rat as I had been doing for months, and no less so to think I had botched a whole semester's work. Fortunately, my professor took a philosophical view when I explained why I was utterly incapable of seeing my project through. As a psychologist, he credited the motive of trying to cure my phobia by means of this experiment, and as a teacher, he could see I had been at it diligently from the start. My grade wouldn't suffer much because of this fiasco. Your plan was perfectly suited to what the course was intended to teach, he allowed. Not every experiment is a success. That's the nature of doing science. The nature of doing many things, I might add. Success is its own reward, but failure is a great teacher too, and not to be feared. Part of my financial aid package committed me to weekly hours in the work-study program. At the start of freshman year, I was assigned to food service at the Commons, but a lingering case of mononucleosis took me off the cafeteria line. I needed a desk job where I couldn't cause an epidemic. I was eager, too, to explore something new. The food service job was standard student fare in a predictable environment. But when I saw a posting for a key punch operator at the computer center, I was intrigued. Computers were a brave new world when I started work there in 1972, and access to their powers was confined to cavernous campus centers. Judith Rowe, head of the center's social sciences division, was a pioneer, among the first to envision the potential of quantitative analysis in the social sciences. She saw that computers would be the key to realizing it. To advance that vision, she encouraged graduate students to use the computer in analyzing their research data, an effort she facilitated by hiring work-study students like me to do the data entry. One project I worked on was with the historian Vernon Burton, who had discovered a treasure trove of old census records near his hometown in South Carolina. There is such serendipity in historical research. Vernon had stopped on a back road to buy a soda when he spotted the stacks of ledgers holding up a shelf. He offered to build the shopkeeper some proper shelves in exchange for the ledgers. My job was to key all the census data onto punch cards and help Vernon run the analysis. I'd taken a typing class in high school, figuring that I could always get a job that way if necessary. That was qualification enough to start, as no one beyond the programmers themselves had any computer skills. Under Judith's guidance, I learned a bit about programming and became skilled at key punching. Because the work was specialized, I earned double what I had been making in the cafeteria. There were other perks too. We could set our own hours and come as we were in jeans and t-shirts. It was a student's dream job, and I kept it all 4 years at Princeton, working there 10 or 15 hours a week on top of other jobs that came and went. The mainframe computer housed in the center gave off so much heat that its room was cooled to frigid temperatures, and I wore a jacket and gloves whenever I went down into the basement to feed my stacks of punch cards into the machine. If the program crashed, I had to inspect each card individually to find the error. Often that meant perusing hundreds or even thousands of punch cards for a single mistaken keystroke, a maddening effort. Next to the monitor that showed the jobs queuing to run on the computer was a metal post that seemed to serve no purpose. It was a while before someone explained it to me. After repeatedly replastering the wall, the administration had decided to install the post for the convenience of frustrated students who invariably needed something to kick when their code crashed. Later, in my senior year, I was taking a break from writing my thesis to catch up on a couple of hours of key punch work when an idea occurred to me. Why not enter the text of my thesis on the same types of punch cards that we were using for data analysis? That way, I could make changes as needed to individual cards without having to retype all the subsequent pages. Judith was intrigued. She thought it was a worthwhile experiment, and she assigned another operator to do the data entry for me. It's hard to be certain, but I might have submitted the very first word process senior thesis in Princeton's history, and I didn't even have to type it myself. In my freshman year, however, I had cause to doubt that I would be able to write a senior thesis eventually. My very first midterm paper for American history class came back with a C, a grade I couldn't remember getting since the 4th grade. I was flattened, but even worse, I had no idea where I had gone wrong. I'd fallen in love with the subject, the Great Depression and Roosevelt's New Deal, pursuing it with everything I had. And the professor had been so inspiring that I wanted to impress her. Nancy Weiss was chair of the department, one of the first women in the whole country to hold such a post. Later, as Nancy Malkiel, she would become the longest-serving dean of the college. Professor Weiss told a familiar tale. Although my paper was chock full of information and even interesting ideas, there was no argumentative structure, no thesis that my litany of facts had been marshaled to support. That's what analysis is, the framework of cause and effect, she said. Her point was a variation of what Miss Katz had been getting at, though now it was coming across more clearly and consequentially. Obviously, I was still regurgitating information. It was dawning on me that in all my classes, I was so concerned with absorbing the facts in the reading that I wasn't marshalling them into a larger argument. By now, several people had pointed out where I needed to go, but none could show me the way. I began to despair of ever learning how to succeed at my assignments when quite unexpectedly it occurred to me. I already knew how. Running into Kenny Moy outside Firestone one day got me thinking about my days in Forensics Club. Suddenly, I realized that what had made me a winner on his team was precisely what I needed to do in my papers. I would not have dreamed of opening my mouth in a debate without first mapping out a position, anticipating and addressing objections, considering how best to persuade my listeners. Seeing the task in the context of another I already performed well largely demystified the problem. In my next few papers, I would start doing in prose what I learned how to do in spoken words. But before I could do that really well, I'd have to face up to another obstacle, the general deficiency of my written English. Whether it is a pregnant pause or even talking with her hands, a debater has many expressive tricks in her repertoire, some of which may cover a multitude of sins against the language. In writing, however, one's words stand naked on the page. Professor Weiss had minced none of her own informing me that my English was weak. My sentences were often fragments, my tenses erratic, and my grammar often just not grammatical. If I could have seen it myself, I would have fixed it, but what was wrong sounded right to me. It wasn't until the following year, when I took Peter Wynn's course in contemporary Latin American history, that the roots of my problem were uncovered. My English was riddled with Spanish constructions and usage. I'd same authority of dictatorship instead of dictatorial authority, or tell it to him instead of tell him. Peter's corrections in red ink were an epiphany. I had no idea that I sounded so much like my mother. But my English wouldn't be as easy to fix as the lack of an argument in my essays. I bought some grammar handbooks and, as part of the same effort, a stack of vocabulary booklets. Over summer vacations spent working at Prospect Hospital, or later at the Department of Consumer Affairs in Spanish Harlem, I devote each day's lunch hour to grammar exercises and to learning 10 new words, which I would later test out on Junior, trying to make them my own. Junior was unfazed by my semantic challenges. He was just happy to be out of my shadow in his final years at Cardinal Spellman. I came to accept during my freshman year that many of the gaps in my knowledge and understanding were simply limits of class and cultural background, not lack of aptitude or application as I'd feared. That acceptance, though, didn't make me feel less self-conscious and unschooled in the company of classmates who'd had the benefit of much more worldly experience. Until I arrived at Princeton, I had no idea how circumscribed my life had been, confined to a community that was essentially a village in the shadow of a great metropolis with so much to offer, of which I'd tasted almost nothing. I was enough of a realist not to fret about having missed summer camp, or travel abroad, or a casual familiarity with the language of wealth. I honestly felt no envy or resentment, only astonishment at how much of a world there was out there and how much of it others already knew. The agenda for self-cultivation that had been set for my classmates by their teachers and parents was something I'd have to develop for myself. And meanwhile, there could come, at any moment, the chagrin of discovering something else I was supposed to know. Once, I was trying to explain to my friend and later roommate Mary Cadet how out of place I sometimes felt at Princeton. "It must be like Alice in Wonderland," she said sympathetically. Alice, who? She was kind enough to salvage the moment with a quick grace. "It's a wonderful book, Sonia. You must read it." In fact, she would guide me thoughtfully toward a long list of classics she had read while I'd been perusing Reader's Digest. What did my mother know of Huckleberry Finn or Pride and Prejudice? Later, at the computer center, I would enter data for a project that Judith Rowe described as a study of how people paid for college. My fingers froze on the keys as I read what I was typing, financial figures of the most well-off at Princeton. This was my first glimpse of trust funds, tax write-offs and loopholes, summer jobs at Daddy's firm that paid the equivalent of a year's tuition, incomes in the millions, dispersed $500,000 here, a few $100,000 for that poor guy there. Between her own salary from Prospect Hospital and her survivor's benefits, which would end very soon, My mother's income was never more than $5,000 a year. Nothing could have clarified as starkly where I stood in relation to some of the people among whom I was now living and learning. I never deluded myself that I could fill in everything I had missed growing up. Nor did I fail to appreciate that I'd had experiences of my own to prize, or that I'd seen some aspects of life of which my classmates were sometimes naively unaware. Suffice it to say that Princeton made me feel that long after those summers spent first discovering the world's great books, I'd have to remain a student for life. It has been my pleasure to be one, actually, long after the virtue has ceased to be such a necessity.